On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego.
I wanted to start with thanking everyone for being here, and to Tara and Daniel in particular for the work that they've done the last few days to get this together. It means more to me than you know. We have a really, I think, amazing lineup of people here for us today. And begin the first panel with some remarks on the theme. And this event really is, as you know, in a way, a kind of launch event for the Center for Design and Geopolitics. So in a way, this theme has to do with us really defining, in a way, the program, but also the set of questions that currently and will define the research program for the center, which I hope you all will continue to be a part of. And in one way, to the questions that drive a lot of the work that we're doing has to do with really this, and that is, what is the future of sovereign geography as a function of multiple forms of globalization and localization, of geographies absorbed by networks, and of networks absorbed by citadels? How will some other geography come to enact and enforce the necessary partitions of border, wall, law, identity, so as to perhaps finally program the world according to its plan and to plan it according to some other program? Or more precisely, how can sovereignty itself, or the political per se, be redesigned, redesignated as the organization of another geography, of another world that is not only possible, but, as they always are, inevitable? These questions are posed, and indeed only posable, as a response to an anticipated space that is opened up, again, by transformations at work upon the geopolitical landscape, upon political geography itself, geographies that had become doxic are now transient and alien, weirdly inhabited. But all available names for this are incomplete, regardless of their timing, of their arrival. Some formal programs have appeared already in advance of what they describe, while others lag in the wake of that which has lagged in the wake of the work that they have already done for the transformation upon the geopolitical, but have done so before they can be recognized and named as a thing or as a force. Among these, the long foretold and postponed eclipse of the nation-state, the ascendance of political theology as existential transnationalism, of cloud computing as the architecture of massive addressability, of a logistical modernity and the endlessly itinerant object, and the return of the city-state in the guise of a multipolar network of megacities and walled mega-gardens among them. So for the question of the future, to which design's ambition is inevitably tied, our attention is split, then, between two images we must hold in mind at once, all the while knowing that one will blend into the other, either with or without our control. We know that to govern an answer to the question of the future is itself dependent upon the management of this exact blur. First, how has sovereignty already been redesigned by these above transformations, whether or not we can properly name or comprehend the character of what is already our contemporary? And second, how can the morphogenesis of the geopolitical deliberately redesign the terms of sovereignty that would, in turn, give it structure? Put differently, the blur is between what is but does not yet have a name and that which might be because we can give it a name and form in advance of itself. To manage the conditions of the former into models of the latter is more than simply politics. It's a geopolitics of the real over an ontological establishment and an enforcement of the projections of the latter into ongoing clarifications of the former. This is a geophilosophy of position, of geography and institutionality, which is to say, of design. So to hold the two in mind at once, that which has no name and that which can be through its nomination, is also to recognize that what variables are constitutive of both, and to allow that constitution to diagram a path of translation between them. And so for this event today, and specifically within the operations of the geopolitical transformation cited above, the question of that compound image, that blur, is specified by the present and the projection of a sovereignty as a function of computation operating at a planetary scale, which in truth it doesn't really do quite yet, despite what we think we know about its career. And this then makes the question in some ways more difficult to ask, precisely because it is in other ways far too easy to ask. To qualify the condition and conditionality of the geopolitical as a function of futurity through the tropes of computation is to risk saying nothing, or worse. Isn't the conflation of globalization with the digital under the rubric of a future that demands some acquiescence to totality, perhaps the quintessential unthought, a mere sequencing of the most obvious into something that stands for history just because it appears to us at the scale of the historical? Now, I believe that it is, and yet at the same time, that very same appearance, albeit as a simulacrum of history, we see this from the virtual perspective of yet another world already utterly realigned, and propose, and this event today is nothing but a proposition, a putting of something into place, as Michel Serres defines thesis. That the very possibility of the unforeseen realignment, the geopolitics redesigned, owes itself to, and in repetition then of that blur above, the historical agency of computation that is both at work and yet which escapes political description, and two, to another that is presupposed by what is already at work, in which both demands our work to redesign it, and which will thereby redesign us in the course of its emergence. And that is, I think, then a rudiment of the condition that we would make, that we cannot design it until it designs us. It's less that the historical simulacrum of computational globalization is some superficial lie that does not describe what it maps, but that what it maps does not yet exist. The formation of a geopolity through planetary computation is less a function of what it has done and what we know that it has done than of what it has done that we don't know, or what we don't know how to know, in which the amplification in the quantity and granularity of the wrong bandwidth will not help. That is, what is meant by the proposed assignment of holding the unnamed plus the projective in mind at once, so that they would inform one another and us through them. So what is then the position from which we might in advance look back, so as attempt to see what is there but we don't know how to name? The encounters that would produce a geopolitical description of computation, and which would, in doing so, provide for the translation between what is at work and what can be constructed is another name for the project of a viable multipolar cosmopolitanism. So, how is it then that that planetary computation has both distorted and reformed modern Westphalian forms of jurisdiction and political geography, and produced new forms of political geography and jurisdiction in its own image, perforating and transcending some borders while reinscribing and introducing new ones at new scales? The modern nation-state was a function of the binding of legal sovereignty, of the limited lawmaking jurisdiction described by the partition of a politicized geography that would contain and cleanly separate sovereign domains into discrete constitutional orders, a compositional alignment of territorial and governmental layers. Now, what is at work through us and for us is a kind of delamination of that compromise, such that jurisdictionality, and indeed the force that would predicate its sovereignty upon its ability to convene and constitute us in its image, is both more and less dependent upon a resolved, singular, bidimensional plane of geopolitical geography than it may have ever been. It's not that the capacity of the state to enforce its governmentalities is undone. Indeed, it's perhaps overdone by this same process of delinking sovereignty and geography, but that its futurity, the state's futurity, its designability, its quality, and its capacity as a prototype of the cosmopolitical regime that might absorb its historical program is to be decided through its negotiation of encounters with incommensurate challenges to its geographic monopoly on jurisdictional priority. A multiplicity of sovereign layers that do not blend, but which, as functions of institutionalized computation, produce compound images. Such encounters are both heterogenetic, productive of what is genuinely new, as well as projective, productive of what is descriptive and consistent, and what can be repeated as the force of law. Only blur provides for the cosmopolitics that could sustain the real, that could constitute a concept of it as a project of governance. And so in the midst of this, we convene here today. These questions, practical programs, are not only technology and policy standard issues, nor can they be properly addressed by extrapolating and extruding native political models from past modern eras, nor can they be fully articulated by political philosophical models, nor can they be directly diagrammed and modeled as engineering equations. Instead, variations of each of these faculties must be enrolled at once. Our program, DGP's program, presumes as a starting point tectonic shifts both in what is possible and what is necessary to re-speculate upon geotechnology and to redesign geogovernance. What are the imagined communities upon which this is based? What does planetary scale computation, how does planetary scale computation generate new geographies over which the traditional state jurisdictions may have little control? How do these spaces constitute authority on their own formal and informal terms? In that future, what is new and what is archaic? What maps, what media of exchange and equivalence, what agency of the object, what politics of risk? Can we design these questions or only be designed by them? Contemporary geopolitics, as we know, are knotted throughout these problematics. How the use of social media in the heroic Arab Spring and in the shock civil society of post-disaster Haiti and Kenya suggest another stratum of crowds and power. How Wikipedia formalizes consensus from a heteroglossia of interests. How Google services do and do not circumvent national authority in China. How is it that some emergent geographies, such as cloud computing, ubiquitous computing, as well as traditional geographies, such as Dar al-Islam, are able to compete with states not only for claims over legitimate violence, but also claims over legitimate citizenship? What are the long-term ramifications that the privatization of the common intellect, that the privatization by search and social network platforms will have on humanity's ability to self-govern? The issues raised by designing geopolitics, this event, are central to what is undoubtedly the most consequential challenge to our capacity to redesign geogovernance. That is the fragility of our climatic and ecological commonwealths. The Copenhagen Conference, its bedraggled successors, underscore why international top-down organizations have a limited ability to enforce transformation through legal consensus. The climate crisis may necessitate the formulation of new scales of jurisdiction, both smaller and larger than the member state, new modes of calculating energy, quantifying, computing, distributing, visualize a polity of electrons, and new forms of network geopolitics that can serve the estimated 650 million migrants by the year 2050. But energy scarcity may, who knows, surprisingly be the opposite of the ultimate challenge. What if radical new techniques of energy production, exchange, and dissemination make the political economies of the electron moot? What if energy is all but free? If so, this is an even more challenging problem for the speculative political science. Regardless, the designability of the ecological commonwealth is not a condition that can be accounted for by simple oppositions of the open versus the closed, of the free versus the unfree, the public versus the private, the state versus the market, the north versus the south, the emerging versus the emergent, the network versus the institution, the smooth versus the striated. We identify closely curated commons, digital commons, ecological commons, biological commons, social commons, as the result of complex adaptive systems operating through specific protocols and regulation mechanisms. And while the value they possess is in principle generally and generously shareable, when they are overexploited by specific initiatives without some mechanism for remuneration to their care, their values as commonwealths are diminished. The open can destroy the closed. The open can destroy the open as much as the closed can. And still, and yet at Hart and Negri are basically correct in that the inversion of over-privatization is not state seizure. It is the returning of ecological assets into a commonwealth, into a state of practical unownability. Now, with that heuristic in mind, can we propose alternatives at the same scale? Clearly, these destabilizations of governance and geography signal critical challenges to our capacities of analysis, but more importantly to our faculties of design. To be explicit, this conference then argues that the architecture of the geopolitical is a meta-design problem, that no single perspective can comprehend, let alone build, but that remains forever a highly volatile arrangement of untranslatable situations into which we have no choice but to enter directly. Territories, institutions, constitutions, conditions of sovereignty and citizenship. While emergent technologies both drive and index these transformations, how they could mediate the emergence of global scale imagined communities of humans and other actors is the critical issue. As I wrote each of you a few days ago, for the past 10,000 years or so, the Holocene era represented a particular geologic economy of climate, flora, and fauna. In the past 100 years, we've seen such a radical transformation of life on the planet's crust, from climate change to population growth, deforestation, ocean acidification, asphaltization, massive extinction. Changes so profound and permanent that another geologic era has been established, what our friend Paul Cruson calls the Anthropocene. And in this, as I said, the bad news is obvious, but the good news to be drawn from the idea of the Anthropocene is that it is in fact quite possible to redesign a planet. We've done it once before, and now we have to do it again. But what are the odds? What is the bet? We need a Copernican shift in our political geography that understands these dynamics as simultaneously and interchangeably futuristic and archaic, technocratic and theologic. The modern diagram is attacked from front and rear. At the same time that we consider financial archipelagos that would game the speed of light by locating offshore sites that optimize the movement of pulses between trading centers, here the incremental value of the commodity is literally determined by its location in the Earth's light cone. We also see Lashkar-e-Taiba attacking Mumbai with Google Earth maps, satellite phones, and stolen SIM cards. The critical insight then is not that jihad could fit inside the map of Google Earth, but rather that Google Earth could and can fit inside the geography of jihad. Now, in recent weeks, we've seen in Egypt and Tunisia and Bahrain and Syria something very different than Mumbai. And here the point is not whether or not social media plays a role in this heroic Arab awakening, but that its triumphs are deeply ambiguous. It surely has made mobilization possible, but mobilization toward what? And in relation to the violence, in what relation to the violence of the surveillance state? Further, we should not be satisfied, I think, with any analysis that predicts the eventual emergence of a Western-style civil society from that. Why? Because we should aim higher than that, because they are aiming higher than that. Any emergency is also an emergence. We mustn't arrogantly propose that we are their future. New democratic genres emerging in the Arab world may be the future of the West, and that is our stake in the outcome. On the other hand, we can just as easily envisage a cloud-based neo-medievalism in the West and in the East, Visigoths with iPads, barbarian theological microstates with thriving biotech and nanotech industries, like San Diego perhaps. Supercomputing does not inoculate us from feudalism, from superstition, but it can perhaps provide for its opposite, a futurism without guarantees, only plasticity. And so the accidents keep piling up, the jurisdictions more interwoven, the cosmopolitanism more plural, more contradictory, more composite, more polyscalar. And if Aurelio's axiom that any new technology is also a new accident is true, then the opposite holds, that any new accident is also a new technology. After his junket to the Consumer Electronics Show last year, Walter Benjamin blogged on the role of utopian futurism in contemporary technoculture, and he wrote that capitalist design requires a permanent utopia of the object, advertising, product pipelining, speculative prototypes. Today, all time is capital, and so all markets are futures markets. Genuine invention depends on the deep recomputability of worldly substance. Catherine Malabou speaks of the world's plasticity. But when and where? Less than this recomputability drives a genuinely new condition to emerge later in time, at some postponed launch event, next fiscal quarter, after the rebuilding of the temple, after the coming of the multitude, whatever. It does so here in space, through the infinite recombinancy of the infinite synchronic field of the longest possible now. Thanks. So.